3 months after Elodie Salazar Hale had been buried in a sealed casket. Her husband was summoned to a restricted hospital floor where two separate heart patterns appeared beside her bed. One rhythm was faint and unstable. The other was smaller, faster, and unmistakably alive. How could a child be growing inside a woman whose funeral had already taken place, and why had everyone closest to her been told that her body was underground? This story took place in Eugene, Oregon, where Corbin Hale managed commercial construction projects and had spent the previous 3 months moving through his days with the mechanical discipline of a man who no longer trusted silence. He worked until the cleaning crews arrived, returned to an apartment that still contained his wife's shoes, and slept with the hallway light on because darkness brought back the telephone call from the highway patrol. Elodie had driven off a county bridge south of Cottage Grove on a dry September morning. Another driver had reported a dark vehicle leaving the area, but no plate number had been captured. Emergency crews pulled her from the wreckage and transported her to Willamette Ridge Medical Center, where physicians declared that the structures responsible for consciousness had permanently stopped functioning. Corbin had seen her beneath a white sheet. He had listened while the attending physician explained brain death, organ failure, legal death, and the absence of any possibility of recovery. Several forms had been placed before him. He remembered signing his name, but grief had reduced the documents to blurred blocks of print. At 2:17 in the morning, on a cold December night, a nurse from Willamette Ridge called his cell phone. She did not explain what had happened. She only told him that an incident involving Elodie required his immediate presence. He drove across Eugene without remembering a single traffic light. When he reached the medical center, the main lobby was almost empty, but two security officers were waiting near the elevators. Instead of taking him toward the emergency department or the administrative offices, they led him through a service corridor and down to the security station. The night supervisor, Arnold Pike, was an older man who had worked at the hospital for nearly 20 years. His hands shook as he replayed footage from the 7th floor. Shortly after midnight, several cameras had filled with static. One image returned long enough to show a hospital bed moving slowly through an empty hallway. A white sheet covered the person lying on it. No nurse, orderly, or physician appeared behind the bed. The wheels turned on their own until the bed passed out of the camera's view. Arnold explained that he had gone upstairs after hearing metal strike the floor through the internal communication system. Before reaching the room, he heard a low sound that resembled a woman struggling to breathe. Then a baby began crying. Corbin rejected the description immediately. Elodie had been declared dead 3 months earlier. Her funeral had taken place before more than 70 relatives, friends, and employees from the Salazar family business. He had watched the casket descend into the grave. The security supervisor moved the video backward. Just before the bed disappeared from view, the sheet shifted near the patient's hand. 5 pale fingers briefly curled over the metal rail. The officers escorted Corbin to the 7th floor. Access doors had been locked, and the hallway lights were running on the emergency circuit. Several nurses stood near a supply room, speaking quietly while avoiding his eyes. At the far end of the corridor, a covered bed rested against a wall. One wheel was still turning. Dr. Lucian Grieve emerged from the final room. He was the neurologist who had explained Elodie's condition after the crash and later supervised the paperwork surrounding her death. His surgical gown carried a dark stain near one sleeve, and his expression hardened when he saw Corbin. The physician ordered security to remove him from the floor. He stated that a technical emergency was underway and that unauthorized entry could endanger a patient. The word patient stopped Corbin. He pushed past one of the officers and reached the observation window before anyone could pull him back. Inside the room, several clinicians surrounded a woman with long black hair. Machines forced air through a breathing tube. Warmed blankets covered her legs. Medication pumps hung beside the bed, and feeding lines disappeared beneath the sheets. The woman's face was partly turned toward the glass. It was Elodie. Her skin had lost the warmth he remembered, but there was no mistaking the shape of her cheekbones, the small mark beside her left eyebrow, or the wedding ring still secured to her finger with medical tape. Corbin struck the glass with his palm. Dr. Grieve caught his arm and warned that any interruption could cause a catastrophic loss of circulation. That statement exposed more than the physician intended. Dead bodies did not require stable circulation. On the monitor beside Elodie, one line rose and fell at long, uneven intervals. A second line moved much faster. A nurse adjusted a sensor near Elodie's abdomen, and the smaller rhythm became clearer. Corbin had spent years attending fertility appointments with his wife. He recognized the pattern before anyone explained it. The second rhythm belonged to a fetus. He demanded to know how long the hospital had been keeping her there. Dr. Grieve refused to answer in the corridor and instructed security to take him to a private conference room. Before the door closed, Corbin saw Elodie's abdomen tighten beneath the blanket. A sudden alarm sounded. Staff members rushed toward the bed while one nurse called for the obstetric team. Corbin remained outside the glass as the smaller heartbeat accelerated, then briefly vanished from the screen. The fetal rhythm returned after several minutes, but the hospital prohibited Corbin from remaining near the room. Two administrators met him downstairs and reminded him that he had signed a confidential medical authorization shortly after the crash. Neither one would provide another copy until the legal department arrived in the morning. Corbin left through the underground parking garage before sunrise. He understood why the hospital was hiding Elodie, because he had helped create the deception. Her mother, Winona Salazar, believed that her daughter had been placed inside the casket at Greyhaven Cemetery. The funeral home had said the injuries from the crash made an open viewing impossible. The family accepted that explanation, and the casket remained sealed through the memorial service. Inside it, there had been no body. Weighted medical transport bags had been arranged beneath the lining to give the casket the expected weight. The funeral director had been told that the burial was symbolic because the remains were being held under a sealed court matter connected to the unidentified vehicle. Only Corbin, Dr. Grieve, two hospital attorneys, and a small medical team knew that Elodie had never left Willamette Ridge. Corbin had approved the plan because public disclosure would have triggered a dispute over control of her body. Winona had already threatened to challenge every medical decision he made. The hospital argued that a public memorial would calm the family, while its attorneys requested confidential guidance from a county judge. 1 week after the nighttime emergency, Darcy Salazar arrived at Corbin's apartment carrying a photograph. Elodie's younger sister worked as an insurance claims adjuster and had learned to distrust incomplete records. The image had been taken from a parking structure facing the medical center. Through a narrow opening between curtains on the 7th floor, a woman with long black hair could be seen lying in a hospital bed. Darcy had enlarged the photograph until the pixels blurred, but the profile still resembled her sister. She accused Corbin of concealing Elodie's body and demanded access to the medical records. When he told her that federal privacy rules and the hospital's legal order prevented him from sharing them, his careful wording made her more suspicious. She noticed that he never said Elodie was in the cemetery. His refusal led Darcy to examine the months after the crash more closely. She reviewed public property filings, company transfers, and charitable donations attached to Corbin's name. Several large payments had gone to a nonprofit account controlled by Willamette Ridge. The account was called the Maternal Continuity Research Fund. One transfer exceeded $200,000. Another payment had been made less than a day after Elodie's funeral. Darcy returned to the apartment while Corbin was at work. She still had an emergency key from the week after the accident, when she had helped remove spoiled food and collect clothing for the memorial. In the locked drawer of his home office, she found a folder containing the authorization he claimed he could not obtain. The language permitted physicians to maintain respiration, circulation, temperature, nutrition, and other biological functions necessary to support fetal development. The authorization remained effective until the pregnancy ended, or continuing support became medically futile. Corbin's signature appeared on the final page. Beneath the agreement were ultrasound images labeled with an abbreviated patient name that did not exist in any public directory. Every examination date came after Elodie had been declared dead. The earliest scan showed a small curved form. Later images revealed a head, spine, hands, and legs. Handwritten notes described steady growth, despite unstable blood pressure and repeated infections. Darcy sat on the office floor with the images spread around her. Elodie had never announced a pregnancy. In the final months of her life, she had spoken about leaving the marriage and beginning again somewhere else. Corbin had also been told years earlier that he could not father a child. Repeated tests at a private fertility practice had shown an extremely low likelihood of conception. The diagnosis had damaged the marriage so deeply that Elodie once stayed with Darcy for almost a month. The hidden pregnancy suggested either an unknown biological father or medical records that had been altered. Darcy photographed every page before returning the folder to the drawer. That night, she called Winona and explained that Elodie's body had never been buried, and that a fetus was being sustained inside her at Willamette Ridge. Their mother did not react with disbelief. Instead, Winona remained silent long enough for Darcy to hear the faint ticking of a wall clock through the cell phone. When she finally responded, her voice carried recognition rather than surprise. She admitted that Elodie had called her shortly before the crash. During that conversation, Elodie confessed that she had done something Corbin might never forgive. Winona refused to say more. She ended the call and drove away from her house before Darcy could reach her. By morning, the safe inside the Salazar family office had been emptied. Darcy entered Elodie's former workspace at Salazar Precision Glass before the employees arrived and began searching invoices, appointment cards, and archived calendars. Her sister had managed contracts for the family company, which made it easy to hide private meetings among supplier visits and construction inspections. 3 names appeared repeatedly during the final 4 months of Elodie's life. 2 belonged to legitimate vendors. The third was Silas Rook, a biomedical equipment specialist who had once worked at Willamette Ridge. Silas had no known connection to commercial glass. His invoices listed consulting services but contained no project numbers, materials, or job locations. Building access records led Darcy to a furnished apartment near the medical center. Elodie had rented it through a limited liability company and paid 3 months in advance. Maintenance records showed that Silas entered the building on the same days. Corbin traveled to job sites in Bend, Medford, and Salem. Darcy obtained permission from the property manager to enter after showing proof that Elodie's estate remained responsible for unpaid cleaning fees. The apartment had been stripped of furniture. Cabinets stood open, and pale rectangles marked places where photographs or equipment had once rested. A paper calendar remained attached to the kitchen wall. The date of the crash had been circled heavily. Beneath it, someone had written that the child had to be saved if Elodie never regained circulation without support. Inside a drawer, Darcy found a small digital recorder with a damaged battery cover. The device still contained one audio file. Elodie's voice described a secret pregnancy and her fear that Corbin would discover the child had been conceived without his knowledge, she said. Dr. Grieve had promised to protect her medical information. She also explained that Silas believed the hospital wanted control over more than the pregnancy. The recording ended when a door opened. A man asked whom she had contacted, and Elodie stopped speaking. Darcy initially interpreted the file as proof of an affair and a secret medical experiment. Dr. Grieve had published academic work about maintaining organ function after brain death. One article discussed rare pregnancies in which mechanical ventilation and medication allowed fetal development to continue after the mother had legally died. The paper had been theoretical. Elodie now appeared to be the case that could transform it into international attention. Rumors inside Willamette Ridge strengthened Darcy's suspicions. A housekeeper told her that Elodie had opened her eyes while the woman was cleaning the room. A resident physician claimed that sounds resembling speech had come from the bed, despite repeated examinations showing no conscious brain activity. Another nurse described violent abdominal movement at precisely 2:17 each morning. During one episode, Elodie's hand closed around the nurse's wrist and left 5 bruises. The hospital explained each event as a reflex, medication effect, or equipment error. Staff members who challenged Dr. Grieve were removed from the 7th floor assignment. One nurse was transferred to an outpatient clinic before the end of her shift. Darcy's investigation began affecting her work. She missed a deadline on a major insurance claim and entered the wrong coverage date on another file. Her supervisor required her to take unpaid leave after she used a company database to search for information connected to Elodie's accident. Without regular income, she faced a choice. She could surrender the records to the Lane County Sheriff's Office and risk exposing the empty burial, the secret pregnancy, and her family's finances. Or she could continue alone and protect the company that still employed nearly 50 people. Winona warned that public attention could destroy Salazar Precision Glass. The company depended on government and hospital contracts, and allegations involving fraud or interference with an investigation could cause lenders to freeze its credit. Darcy chose to contact a detective anyway. Before the meeting occurred, someone broke into her apartment. Nothing valuable was taken. The intruder opened drawers, removed the memory card containing photographs of Corbin's documents, and left the digital recorder on the kitchen counter, with its battery missing. The incident convinced Darcy that another person knew what she had found. She copied the remaining evidence to an online storage account and scheduled it to be released to the sheriff's office, a local attorney, and a newspaper reporter if she failed to cancel the transfer within 48 hours. That evening, as she returned from buying a replacement lock, a thin man stepped from behind the stairwell door. He had hollow cheeks, graying hair, and a hospital identification mark still visible on an old jacket. Silas Rook looked repeatedly toward the parking lot before identifying himself. He said he had left Oregon after the crash because someone had threatened to connect him to the brake damage and the secret fertility procedure. Darcy asked whether he was the father. Silas denied any romantic relationship with Elodie. According to him, their meetings had been arranged to move frozen biological material, coordinate medical appointments under a private account, and keep the pregnancy hidden from both families. He also said Dr. Grieve had not made the final decision to maintain Elodie's body. The person who insisted that every machine remained connected was Corbin. Silas's appearance forced Darcy to cancel the meeting with the detective and move to a motel near the interstate. He refused to speak inside her apartment because he believed its entrance camera had already captured him. From the motel room, he explained that Corbin had learned about the pregnancy before the crash. He had hired a private investigator after finding unexplained medical charges on a joint credit card. Photographs of Elodie entering the rented apartment with Silas convinced him that his wife was carrying another man's child. Corbin confronted Elodie the night before she died. The argument lasted long enough for a neighbor to report raised voices to the apartment manager. Elodie left before dawn with a suitcase and a folder of medical records. Her car went through the bridge barrier several hours later. The first mechanical inspection found a damaged brake line. That detail never entered the public crash report because a second examination blamed the rupture on impact. Silas had obtained photographs from the original mechanic showing a clean cut made before the collision. Darcy assumed Corbin had sabotaged the vehicle, but Silas produced a copied security image from the Salazar Company garage. The image showed Winona beside Elodie's car. Late on the previous evening, the family matriarch had learned that her daughter planned to leave Corbin and disclose the pregnancy. Years earlier, Corbin had invested heavily in Salazar Precision Glass when the business was close to bankruptcy. Their marriage agreement allowed him to withdraw certain loans and purchase options if Elodie ended the marriage after concealing a child conceived outside it. Winona believed the company, its employees, and the family property would be lost. She had instructed a maintenance worker to damage the brake system enough to prevent Elodie from leaving town. When the worker refused, Winona attempted it herself using instructions she found online. She expected the pedal to fail before Elodie reached the highway, forcing her to call for help. The line ruptured completely on the downhill road leading to the bridge. Corbin learned of Winona's involvement when a private investigator recovered garage footage. Instead of reporting it, he used the evidence to take control of her voting shares in the company. In return, he concealed the footage and supported the official explanation that the brake line had broken during the crash. His decision protected Winona and placed the Salazar business under his influence. It also allowed him to control every medical choice involving Elodie. Silas then corrected the assumption that the fetus came from an unknown donor. Elodie had discovered that the infertility diagnosis given to Corbin years earlier might be false. A sample stored during the couple's previous fertility treatment remained at a private clinic. With Silas's help, she transferred it to another reproductive practice under confidential billing. Dr. Grieve had helped keep the pregnancy out of the medical center's shared record, because Elodie feared Corbin would accuse her of violating his reproductive rights. Silas never saw the donor identification. Those documents were placed in a sealed file that Dr. Grieve later removed from the fertility clinic. Before Darcy could ask why the neurologist had become involved so early, Corbin called her. His controlled voice had disappeared. He reported that Elodie had opened her eyes and that the medical team was preparing an emergency delivery. Darcy drove to Willamette Ridge with Silas following in another car. As they reached the 7th floor, the hospital's backup electrical system began cycling. Red emergency lights filled the corridor while elevators stopped between floors. Inside Elodie's room, clinicians transferred her onto an operating table. Her blood pressure had fallen, the fetal heartbeat was slowing, and medication could no longer stabilize both circulatory systems. Corbin stood outside the observation window with Winona, who had arrived carrying the empty safe deposit box from the company office. Darcy recognized that her mother had attempted to remove the garage footage and financial agreements before law enforcement could obtain them. Dr. Grave instructed the surgical team to begin the delivery. Elodie's eyes opened wide as a medication caused muscles in her neck and face to contract. Her pupils did not focus, yet her head gradually turned toward the window. Corbin stepped closer. For several seconds, Elodie's face appeared directed at him. Moisture gathered near one eye and moved slowly down her temple. Winona covered her mouth. Darcy gripped the window frame. Even Silas, who understood the machinery better than the others, took a step backward. Then the larger waveform on the monitor flattened into a continuous line. Staff members closed the surgical doors, and Corbin was left staring at the reflection of his own face where Elodie had been. The obstetric team continued the operation, while another group restored Elodie's circulation with medication and mechanical compression. The fetal monitor returned briefly, then disappeared as the emergency power system switched between circuits. Corbin, Darcy, and Winona remained outside the operating room. Each had information that could destroy the others. Corbin knew about the brake line. Winona knew the infertility diagnosis had been manipulated. Darcy held copies of the medical authorization, ultrasound images, and Silas's evidence. Nearly an hour passed before Dr. Grieve emerged. His hands trembled from exhaustion, and his gown had been replaced. He confirmed that the baby had been delivered alive at an extremely premature stage and transferred to a neonatal team. He avoided questions about Elodie. A weak cry came through the doorway. One nurse carried a child wrapped in a warmed white blanket toward a portable incubator. The infant was barely over 1 pound, with delicate limbs and translucent skin, consistent with a birth near the edge of viability. Darcy saw the baby's eyes open as the nurse crossed beneath the surgical light. Another clinician checked the portable monitor and called Dr. Grieve back. No heartbeat appeared on the screen. The baby continued crying. Before the team could reconnect the sensors, the 7th floor lost power. Emergency batteries kept the ventilators running, but hallway lights and several monitors shut down. The infant's cries echoed through the internal communication speakers, the elevator panel, and Darcy's cell phone. The same sound appeared to come from every direction. When the lighting returned, the portable incubator was empty. A thin trail of water from a spilled warming basin led toward Elodie's room. The door stood partly open. Her body had been returned to the bed and covered to the shoulders. The premature infant lay beside her, inside a heated support cradle. One of Elodie's hands extended from beneath the blanket. Her fingers rested near the child's chest. With each cry, 2 fingers appeared to move. Corbin entered before the staff could stop him. He interpreted the motion, the open eyes, and the moisture on her face as proof that Elodie had returned. He demanded that the hospital continue every treatment and called for another neurological examination. Dr. Grieve did not share that conclusion. He ordered Corbin removed from the bedside and searched for the nurse who had moved the baby. The person responsible was Kaylin Moreau, a neonatal nurse who had cared for Elodie during several overnight shifts. She had placed the child beside the mother because she believed the family deserved one final moment before support was withdrawn. In the darkness, she had disconnected the portable cardiac leads while moving the infant. The crying that passed through the speakers came from an internal microphone left active near the cradle. Electrical interference routed the signal into multiple hospital devices, including a patient communication application installed on Darcy's phone during an earlier visit. Before the medical staff could explain any of that, two detectives from the Lane County Sheriff's Office entered with a senior deputy medical examiner and the hospital's risk management director. Darcy's scheduled evidence transfer had activated when she failed to cancel it. The materials had reached law enforcement, and Silas had provided his original files at the entrance. The deputy medical examiner ordered the room preserved and requested every record connected to Elodie's declaration of death, continued organ support, fetal treatment, funeral transfer, and accident investigation. Detectives separated Corbin, Winona, Dr. Grieve, and Silas for interviews. Dr. Grieve attempted to retrieve a folder from a locked cabinet before the detectives reached it. The risk director stopped him and surrendered the folder. Inside were laboratory reports from the fertility clinic, chain of custody forms for a stored reproductive sample, and a prenatal paternity examination authorized after Elodie's crash. The fetus had not been conceived with material from Silas. No anonymous donor had been involved. The recorded probability identified Corbin Hale as the biological father. Corbin read the report twice. His anger toward Elodie collapsed into confusion because the result contradicted every fertility test he had received during their marriage. Winona lowered her eyes before anyone questioned her, the detectives noticed. A court-authorized laboratory repeated the paternity analysis using a new sample from Corbin and a medical sample taken from the infant. The result confirmed that he was the father, allowing investigators to reconstruct the secret that had shaped the marriage, the crash, and the months of concealed treatment. Corbin had never been medically incapable of fathering a child. Years earlier, Winona paid a physician at a private fertility practice to alter his laboratory report. The Salazar Family Trust contained an old provision transferring a controlling block of company shares to Elodie and any direct descendant after the birth of her first child. Winona feared losing authority over the business and the property connected to it. She believed delaying pregnancy would preserve her control until she could persuade Elodie to rewrite the trust. The false diagnosis damaged the marriage instead. Corbin withdrew emotionally, while Elodie became convinced that any future child would require a donor he would never accept. After noticing inconsistencies in his medical file, she contacted Silas, who knew how fertility equipment, storage systems, and clinic transfers were managed. Silas helped her locate a reproductive sample Corbin had stored during the couple's earlier treatment. Elodie used the sample through a private assisted reproduction clinic. Without telling him, she conceived and was almost 3 months pregnant when her car left the bridge. The pregnancy was the unforgivable act she had described to Winona. She had used Corbin's biological material without his informed consent, even though her intention had been to give them the child they had once wanted. When Elodie arrived at Willamette Ridge after the crash, physicians restored her heartbeat but found catastrophic brain damage. Repeated examinations showed no blood flow capable of supporting consciousness, no meaningful brain response, and no possibility of recovery. Under Oregon law and accepted medical standards, she was dead after brain death was formally declared. Her pregnancy created an extraordinary decision. The fetus still had a heartbeat, but was far too young to survive outside the uterus. Corbin, as the legal spouse, signed an authorization requesting continued mechanical support, while the hospital consulted its ethics committee and sought confidential judicial guidance. The ventilator moved oxygen into Elodie's lungs. Medication maintained blood pressure. Feeding lines supplied nutrition. Warmed fluids controlled temperature, and antibiotics treated infections. Her heart continued beating because oxygen and medication allowed the muscle to function, not because her mind remained alive. Dr. Grieve had not conducted a secret attempt to revive her. His team was preserving the biological environment surrounding the fetus until the child reached a viable stage. The frightening events on the 7th floor also had physical explanations. Elodie's open eyes resulted from muscle relaxation, changes in medication, and incomplete closure of the eyelids. The movement of her neck came from spinal reflexes and contractions triggered during the emergency. Her hand closed around the nurse's wrist because the spinal cord can produce powerful movements even when the brain can no longer create thought or intention. The fluid that crossed her cheek was not evidence of grief. Tear glands can continue responding to irritation when the structures responsible for awareness have stopped functioning. The bed seen moving through the corridor had been pushed by an orderly during the security camera failure. The orderly stepped into a recessed doorway to clear equipment, leaving the bed rolling several feet on a sloped section of flooring. The hand movement on the video was another reflex caused by the shift in position. The baby never cried without a heartbeat. The portable leads had detached, while Nurse Kaylin moved the child, so the blank display reflected a missing signal rather than cardiac arrest. The internal communication failure merely spread the infant's voice across the floor. Dr. Grieve faced a medical board review for helping conceal the continued support from Elodie's family and for permitting misleading funeral arrangements. The board found that the treatment itself had a defensible medical purpose, but the secrecy, poor documentation, and removal of fertility records violated professional standards. He lost his leadership position and was prohibited from supervising similar cases. The funeral home and hospital reached a civil settlement with Darcy and other relatives who had been led to believe Elodie's body was inside the grave. The cemetery later removed the weighted casket in a private proceeding supervised by the county. Corbin cooperated with the renewed crash investigation. The files he surrendered proved that Winona had interfered with the brake line and that he had concealed evidence in exchange for control of her shares. Winona was arrested after the original garage footage was recovered from a backup server. Prosecutors did not claim that she intended to kill her daughter. They argued that she knowingly created a deadly risk to prevent Elodie from leaving. More than a year later, Winona pleaded guilty to manslaughter and tampering with evidence. Corbin entered a separate plea for obstructing the investigation. His cooperation, lack of involvement in the brake damage, and responsibility for a medically fragile infant resulted in probation, financial penalties, and the loss of the company shares obtained through the secret agreement. Darcy became the temporary manager of Salazar Precision Glass, while an independent trustee reorganized the business. She did not forgive Corbin, but she did not attempt to remove the child from him. Family court approved a parenting plan that required medical follow-up, home nursing support, and regular contact with Darcy during the infant's recovery. The baby remained in neonatal intensive care for several months. She required assisted breathing, feeding support, and repeated examinations, yet she gradually gained weight and showed no major neurological injury. Corbin named her Elodie Marinhale. After the delivery, doctors maintained Elodie's circulation only long enough for the family to enter the room separately. Darcy touched her sister's hair. Corbin placed the newborn's photograph beside her hand. Winona viewed her through the glass under the supervision of a detective. The machines were then reduced in a controlled medical process. Without the ventilator and medication, Elodie's heartbeat slowed and stopped. There was no final movement, no whispered name, and no return of awareness. Years later, the younger Elodie grew into a healthy child who knew that her mother had died before they could meet. Corbin never told her that people once believed the woman in the hospital bed had risen from death. He explained only that her mother's body had protected her until she was strong enough to breathe. In a small box at home, he kept the first photograph taken after the birth. The infant rested beside a motionless woman whose hand had been placed near her chest. The image did not show a miracle or a ghost. It showed a body that had become a silent shelter after the person within it was already gone.